In the late 1950s and early 1960s, steam was enjoying its Indian summer as the much-loved Stephenson locomotive gave way throughout the world to the alien diesel and electric locomotives. In Great Britain, interest in railways was on the increase, and the then novel BBC television was persuaded that there was an audience for pure railway films, and so Railway Roundabout was born. For 5 years, from 1958 to 1962, Patrick Whitehouse and John Adams filmed, edited and produced films about all aspects of railways, presenting 10 25-minute shows a year at 5:30 in the afternoon, ostensibly for children, but in time for many adults to tune in. The films themselves were carefully retained and are now part of our national heritage, being held in the care of the National Railway Museum at York. The programmes which form this series of 5 have been prepared from those original films, so we can all once again relive the great days of the Railway Roundabout. The 4th year of the Railway Roundabout started like the first, with the closure of a railway, celebrated once again by the Stephenson Locomotive Society, who ran a special train from Barlow to Festiniog on January the 22nd, 1961, over a year after regular passenger services had ceased on the 2nd of January, 1960. 5 days after this train ran, freight would also cease for reasons we'll come to later. Patrick Whitehouse and John Adams, who filmed all the material for the BBC's monthly programme about railways, took the show's assistant producer to a rain-swept northwest Wales and filmed the arrival of the special at the little Barlow town station from the platform end and the road bridge at the north end. Two panniers of the Great Western headed the train. The line had been built by the Great Western Railway as a means of transporting the slate products of the Festiniog area to the Midlands over a more direct route than that offered by the London and North Western Railway's branch from Llandudno on the North Wales coast. It hadn't really succeeded. It lasted less than 80 years, having opened in 1882. The first part of the line ran through rural scenery, climbing hard to its first passing station at Aranig, 1,135 feet above sea level. Pat Whitehouse used to arrange the painting and making of the special headboards used by the SLS. He ran a construction company, and so Railway Roundabout had to be filmed in his spare time. The SLS headboard was wooden. Aranig had provided some slate business through the years and had sidings serving its slate quarries. On this occasion, Pat and John had travelled in separate cars, and at Aranig, Pat forsook his car whilst John drove on ahead for line-side footage. Pat's car was driven ahead by Shirley, the assistant producer, as he joined the footplate crew. The railway's downfall had come about because a lake was required near the new nuclear power station being built at Trawsfynydd to act as a reservoir for Liverpool waterworks. This would flood the railway and road, and although the road was to be diverted, it was considered simpler to close the railway rather than treat it like the road. Trawsfynydd station itself was another passing loop. Its greatest activity probably came from the military, who used the area for artillery practice. Seen on the footplate with a characteristic beret is the chairman of the SLS, T.P. Halley-Brown. Pat alighted here to face the storms once again. There were 5 more halts between Trawsfynydd and Festiniog, the line running downhill with gradients as steep as 1 in 50. Arrival at the Great Western's terminus alongside the Festiniog Railway's narrow gauge terminus attracted a great deal of interest. At this time, the preserved railway was operating at the other end of its formation from Portmaddock. It was also cut off from its terminus by an artificial lake, but unlike the standard gauge line, was later to build a new route to go round the reservoir. The evidence of the narrow gauge line is all around as the panniers run round. In the background, the hills are littered with the product of the area's staple industry, slate. At this time, there were 2 independent standard gauge termini here. They were later joined by a cord to allow nuclear flask trains to serve the power station at Trawsfynydd. With all the closures taking place, British Railways had a surplus of Great Western pannier tanks, so they sold a number of them to London Transport, who renumbered them and painted them in their house colours, maroon. Despite its electric image, London Transport still required a small number of steam locomotives for engineers' duties and to run spoiled trains to a rubbish tip at Croxley. In total, it acquired 13 panniers, the last surviving until 1971. LT also had a number of locomotives inherited from its constituent companies. On this visit to Neasden Shed in May 1961, the railway roundabout crew filmed the former Metropolitan Railways numbered 93 in its London transport guise as L52. The engine was a Class F 062 tank and was fitted with dual braking, having a Westinghouse air pump in front of the side tank and an air reservoir on the top of it. She was built in 1901 by the Yorkshire Engine Company and withdrawn in July 1964. The Metropolitan Railways number 1 was an 044 tank numbered L44 by London Transport. This Class E locomotive still works on London Transport on occasions. After withdrawal in 1964, it was preserved and has been used in the 1980s and 1990s in special steam workings on London Transport metals. Traditional LT colours were reds, but in 1961, unpainted aluminium electric stock was just being introduced on the Circle and Metropolitan lines. This was the first unit, which had arrived at Neasden for trials. This was to be the face of London transport for the next 30 years. Colour would be reintroduced in the 1990s. This new stock was being introduced as part of the extension of electrification on the Metropolitan main line out of Baker Street. The destination box says it all. Electrification to Amersham would eliminate the long-standing changeover from steam to electric at Rickmansworth. The LNER and later British Railways had the responsibility for providing motive power north of Rickmansworth since 1937. In 1961, LMS Fairburn tanks were in use. The locomotives seen here had arrived from the north and Amersham and would give way to LT electric locomotives here. The electric engine is one of a class of 20, which would just see the year out, all being withdrawn when the Amersham line went live. All these electrics bore names. They'd been effectively supplied in 1921-22 by Metropolitan Vickers as rebuilds of earlier locomotives. 4 were to be retained as service engines after withdrawal, one of which later went to LT's own Covent Garden Museum, and one which still remains in service stock to this day, number 12, Sarah Siddons. Wearing an appropriate destination board, Sherlock Holmes moves off. The carriages are the well-known dreadnought stock that bore commuters from the city to the Buckinghamshire countryside for over half a century. We'll see them again soon. City of Truro, the Great Western Railway's near-legendary 440, which is credited with the first 100 mile an hour on rails, introduces us to the equally famous Swindon Works, a shrine to all Great Western enthusiasts. The railway roundabout producers, Pat Whitehouse and John Adams, made their pilgrimage to Swindon to see both City of Truro and a number of other rather special Great Western locomotives at their birthplace, as nearly all of that railway's engines had been built here. In 1957, the City of Truro had been returned to special traffic duties after a period of static preservation lasting from withdrawal in 1931, during which time she'd been on display at York Museum, the predecessor to the National Railway Museum, which is her custodian today. The engine deserved preservation for reasons other than her speed exploits, as she represented the first flowering of the designs of George Jackson Churchward, who introduced his famous taper boiler outline with its brass safety bonnet on what was still essentially a 19th century double-frame chassis, which was in the tradition of his Victorian predecessor, William Dean. She was also Swindon's 2000th locomotive. Another very famous and familiar Great Western outline was that of the pannier tank. This was also an extension of Victorian design, constantly updated in the 20th century. However, behind this tank engine are the main reasons for this visit. It's hauling 2 preserved Great Western engines out of their resting place in the works to be displayed for the cameras, each one representing the pure design of Dean and Churchward respectively. The earlier design was a Dean Goods, a light 060 tender engine, which had been the mainstay of goods services at the end of the Victorian era. 260 of these engines had been built, plus another 20 with double frames like City of Truro. Many had been sent abroad in both the First and Second World Wars for military use, and a few had survived to become British Railways property in 1948. Number 2516 was one of the final two survivors, having been withdrawn in 1956 and retained for preservation. She was returned to Great Western green livery, but not put on display, being kept in the works, which accounts for her shabby condition. Her tall chimney and very large steam dome were hallmarks of Dean's designs, as were the small tender and cab. The result was quite an elegant and distinctive outline. The second engine was Lode Star. She'd been withdrawn in 1951 and retained for preservation, as she was then the oldest example of the first modern Great Western Express passenger engines, the earlier members of her class having been scrapped or rebuilt as castles in the 1930s. The Star class was Churchward's four-cylinder design for the heaviest duties. The design was destined to become a classic and was developed into both the Castle and King classes, which became the final Great Western Express engines. The lineage is also traceable to the LMS Railway, where Sir William Stanier, a former Great Western man, designed the Princess Royal Pacifics along the same general lines. John Adams, seen at the front of the engine indulging in a spot of cosmetic work, had decided the engine should look more presentable for the cameras. Her sojourn in the works had left her looking rather neglected. This engine had been built as part of the first production batch of 10 Stars in 1907, but she was still in the condition in which she was withdrawn, with outside feed pipes to her safety valve cover and elbow steam pipes. She was later to be put on public display with both the other engines seen here at the new Swindon Museum, and in 1992 was taken from there to be displayed at the National Railway Museum in York, a fine example of the first truly modern British express passenger locomotive. A greater contrast could hardly be imagined than with the next railway featured on Railway Roundabout. In June 1961, Pat and John drove to the Lake District to film the narrow-gauge Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway, which operated on the western side of Cumbria. Pat recalls a long, tedious journey north, alleviated only by the Preston Bypass, the first part of the M6 motorway to be built, and the first British motorway at all. In its time, it was quite a novelty. This emphasizes the magnitude of the task that befell the two Railway Roundabout cameramen. Both had full-time careers, with the television series being made in their spare time. They were committed to producing 10 25-minute shows a year, which involved not only the filming, but also arranging the facilities on the railways, driving around the country in the days when a trip to the Cumbrian coast from Birmingham necessitated an overnight stay, and making the programs. The latter involved cutting and editing the film, researching and preparing a commentary, taking the film and showing it to the BBC for approval, and then presenting it at 5:30 in the afternoon live. And for each programme, they were paid £90 between them, with no expenses. However, that meant they bought the film stock and retained the copyright. Consequently, they were able to arrange for the subsequent safekeeping of the original films at the National Railway Museum, York, and the availability of these programs prepared from the films. As the Little Mikado River Esk arrives at the first crossing place on the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway, it's noticeable how wide the space between the lines is. This goes back to the origins of the railway, which was originally a 3-foot gauge and built to extract hematite ore from Boot, 7 miles inland from Ravenglass on the Esk estuary. It was a woeful failure and eked out a precarious existence from 1876 to 1913 when it closed, apparently for good. But this was the era of passenger-carrying miniature railways, and the leader in the field, Bassett Loke, took over the derelict concern and rebuilt it to 15-inch gauge. The railway reopened to passenger traffic at the height of the Great War on the 28th of August 1915, going as far as Manchester. The railway progressively reopened further along the route, being completed in April 1917 to the original terminus at Boot. Further development ensued, with a new terminus opened near to the Eskdale Road at Dalegarth in 1926, and the opening of a granite quarry at Beckford in 1922, with a crushing plant at Merthwaite. A standard gauge trackbed was then laid around the narrow gauge line for 2.5 miles from Ravenglass, opened in July 1929 to give efficient transshipment. After the Second War, in 1949, the Keswick Granite Company acquired the line because of the quarrying activities. It put the line up for sale once again in 1958. As Pat Whitehouse took the departure from ground level, John Adams stood on the water tank. Preservation had just started for the Ratty. The railway has always been known by this affectionate term. A group of enthusiasts had bid successfully at a public auction in September 1960, and in March 61 formed a new operating company, which was now running the railway for the first time. The principal mover behind the £12,000 required to buy the railway was Colin Gilbert, who can be seen on the train. He was the second passenger facing Shirley from the BBC, who'd come with Pat and John. Colin Gilbert was another Birmingham enthusiast, a stockbroker in that city. The new terminus at Dalegarth remains the terminus today, the Preservation Society having given the railway the longest period of stability in its career, with no sign of any changes needed or likely. The locomotives seen in this film still ply their way up the valley, and the railway is now well founded. Passengers can still leave the train here for a trip around Wastwater and rejoin the train at Urton Road, or picnic or walk around the foot of the Furness Hills. The locomotives have had an equally varied career, although River Esk, featured here, has seen little change. She's a Davy Paxman-built engine supplied in 1923. A similar machine was supplied in 1966 for the Society, and the railway has since entered the locomotive building business itself, exporting a replica machine to Japan. Long may it flourish.
You've got a gun. Oh, yes, yes, yes. As the lady, yeah.
It doesn't get any water on the paint.
We now turn to another of those special trains put on for the benefit of Pat and John's programme, which was to illustrate another facet of railway operation, the goods train and its banking procedures. Also to be shown was another variation on the picking up of section tablets or tokens in use on a single line railway. In this case, an automatic apparatus known as the Whittaker system, after its designer. The railway chosen for this feature was one which had a special place in the hearts of enthusiasts everywhere, the Somerset and Dorset Railway, and two of its unique Class 7F 280s were allocated to the 11 a.m. down goods from Bath for this film. The Whittaker apparatus was unique to the S&D and allowed the tablet to be picked up or set down at speed. The banking engine was one of the same class as the train engine and was to push the train up the severe 1 in 50 gradient out of Bath through Devonshire Tunnel as far as Combe Down Tunnel. There it would drop back, not being coupled up to the train, and return light engine to Bath. At Radstock, a Class 2P heads a British Railways Class 9F on a northbound passenger train. This was normal procedure for passenger trains rather than using a banker. In the foreground is an LMS Class 3F Ginty tank, to be used as the banker for our freight. Procedure here was similar to that at Bath, with the Ginty buffering up to the rear of the train. However, in this instance, it was coupled onto the train. The driver of the banker would have a special banking staff to allow him to run back later. From Radstock, the gradient is 1 in 55 immediately upon leaving the platform end, and there followed a 7.5-mile continuous climb over the Mendip Hills, with a large proportion of it steepening to 1 in 50. The little station at Midsummer Norton, with its prize-winning flower beds, stood between a 1 in 50 and 1 in 53 gradient on the severest part of the southbound climb. Note another Ginty banker waiting to return to Radstock on the other line. The Somerset and Dorset's full title was Somerset and Dorset Joint Railway, as it had been owned jointly by the Midland Railway and the London and South Western Railway. Even into nationalisation, these railways' characteristics were still apparent, the South Western being responsible for the infrastructure and coaches, whilst the Midland provided the locomotives, most notably the 7F280s. The engines were built to a unique design for Derby, which normally favoured small inside cylinder locomotives. The 7Fs were built specifically for the S&D and worked nowhere else. 11 were built in all in 2 batches. This was one of the second batch, which had started life with a much larger boiler, receiving the standard Midland boiler in 1954. She was the last of her class to be withdrawn, but 2 have been preserved. The engine was specially cleaned for the occasion, and the crews knew they were television stars. The train is seen here struggling up towards Chilcompton on the long climb to Maysbury Summit, 811 feet above sea level. At Maysbury, the 7F had one more overbridge to pass, and then it was over the hump. The guard on the train had to be ready here with a special hook kept on the front handrail of the banking engine to uncouple it as the summit was reached and the train engine took the strain of the couplings. It was essential here to maintain tight coupling of the wagons to prevent a surge as the train set off downhill, which was over a line with equally severe gradients in the opposite direction. Having uncoupled, the banker returns wrong road to Binnaker and back to Radstock. Meanwhile, the 7F's 8-couple wheelbase is put to good use as its brakes control the loose coupled freight train down the bank. Finally, we arrive at the famous Evercreech Junction, a station in the middle of nowhere, where the sound of shunting filled the skies around the clock. Here the train terminated. By 1961, many pre-grouping locomotive designs were rapidly going to the scrap heap. The pace of change on British railways was picking up. As we've seen, there had been a steady pruning of the branch line network, which was accelerating, eventually flowering into the infamous beaching rationalisation. Enthusiasts realised that the days were growing fewer when they could see even what were once commonplace locomotives working in familiar territory. And attention was gradually switched from the high-profile express classes to the humble 060s and small tank engines. These became favourites for special trains and tours. Many were now the last examples of the various pre-grouping railways design practices, and the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway 060 tender and 242 tank engines were good examples of this trend. Both were Aspinall designs. We joined the Railway Roundabout team with another visitor to Manchester's Newton Heath shed in the summer of 1961. This was the principal locomotive shed of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway in Manchester, and was situated in the V of the lines to Rochdale and Oldham, on the northeastern side of the city. It provided locomotives for all varieties of traffic, and had once been home to many of these Class II 242 tanks, which were a very characteristic Lancashire and Yorkshire type. This one, however, had come from the other side of Lancashire, as she was allocated to Southport Shed on the Lancashire coast. The shed had 2 turntables. This one was situated in front of the modern coaling plant and the shed itself. Behind the shed, which was of the through type, was another of 70-foot diameter. This one was 60 foot, and therefore not big enough to turn the longest locomotives. 18 of Stanya's Class 8F280s were included on its roster of around 170 locomotives, the top-linked passenger engines being 10 Jubilees. Another example of the 060 tender engine is seen behind the tank as it passes the coaling plant. This had two 150-ton bunkers and served two tracks. Unusually, this rail tour wasn't to start in the station, although Newton Heath Station itself was adjacent to the shed, and the carriage sidings were opposite the shed. The tour passengers had to come in through the shed environs, no doubt a bonus to the loco spotters amongst them. Fortunately, most were young and agile enough to climb the footsteps. The train consisted of 4 coaches, with the tank buffering on at the north end. The 060 goods engine would be attached at the other end, as the train would encounter some stiff gradients on its tour. From Newton Heath, the train ran along the main line to Rochdale for 3 miles, before turning to the east at Middleton Junction. This was the first Lancashire and Yorkshire main line to Oldham. Just beyond Middleton Junction, the train turned off the line onto the short branch to Chatterton. This was quite steeply graded and only half a mile long. It was freight only. The line from Middleton Junction to Oldham was well known, as it boasted one of the steepest adhesion work gradients in the country, traversed by normal passenger trains, at 1 in 27 for 3/4 of a mile. This was the reason this train had a locomotive each end. Oldham boasted no less than 4 stations, 2 of them on the Lancashire and Yorkshire route, and 1 each from the London and North Western and joint LNWR and Great Central line from Ashton-under-Lyne. Competition was fierce in the area, with the Lanky controlling the territory to the northwest of Oldham. Electrification of the line to Bury was expected to lead to the same treatment for the Oldham area, but this never materialized. The last part of the tour involved the 242 tank on its own. It was one of the last of its type to work, and the class, built between 1889 and 1910 at Horwich, was completely withdrawn by 1962. One is preserved as L&Y number 1008 at the National Railway Museum at York. The general manager of the Tallaghflin Railway, Harold Parker, closes the door of the Bin Valley coach for 2 special visitors to the Welsh Narrow Gauge Railway in the summer of 1961. Riding in the train headed by number 1, Tallaghflin, are Bill Hartley and his son. Bill was the BBC anchorman for Railway Roundabout, and this was a day trip to the various Welsh railways for him and his son, accompanying Pat Whitehouse and John Adams. The train arrives at Dolgoth Falls, the principal intermediate stop on the railway. Bill and his son were in the 4th coach, which had come from the Glyn Valley tramway near Llangollen. This particular film served to anchor the anchorman into the programmes. Normally, Bill and the other anchorman, Peter Cranmer, were only involved in the studio, when they tied the programme into the other children's hour programmes and gave the professional link for Pat and John, who were, of course, amateurs as far as television was concerned. The train consisted of an original Tallaghflin box van, 2 original Tallaghflin coaches, a Glyn Valley coach, 2 ex-Penryn open coaches, and 2 new coaches built by the Preservation Company. Abergynolwyn was still the terminus of the railway at this time. Back at Wharf Station, Pat Whitehouse, turning to camera, stood by as a double-headed train prepared to leave. The second engine was number 4, which had recently been fitted with a diesel ejector and its associated flat-sided chimney. This was provided at no cost to the railway by Dr. Giesel, the Austrian inventor, who was trying to interest British Railways in his device. He presented it to the Talythin's chairman, the Earl of North Esk, in the mistaken belief that as he was aristocracy, he would know the Queen and could get her to influence BR. Such was continental thinking. The front engine came off at Bridie Ronan. This was number 6, which had been presented to the railway by Douglas Abelson, a Birmingham scrap and plant hire merchant, who'd acquired it from its original home at Calshot near Southampton, where the Brabazon flying boats were built. Beyond Abergynolwyn, the railway had continued as a mineral extension to the present terminus at Nantgwynol, where a series of rope-worked inclines led up to the quarries at the top, which were the reason for the railway's existence in the first place. Rails still remained in situ, although overgrown. At the top, the sheds and workshops of the quarries remained, and Bill Hartley investigated these. They still remain today, although somewhat overgrown. The Roundabout team next visited Aberystwyth, where the Vale of Rydal still ran from its original independent terminus alongside the main British Railways station. Bill Hartley was introduced to the footplate crew, who were, of course, British Railways staff, as the line was still owned by the nationalised railway system. Locomotive number 8 had recently been repainted in the full express passenger lime green livery. 3 of these engines had been built for the Little Railway, 1 for the original independent Vale of Rydal, and 2 in 1923 by the Great Western at Swindon. Number 8 was one of these Swindon engines and had received its name in 1956. Departure was on the original formation, which crossed a road just around the curve. This is the second of the Swindon engines, number 7. A stop was made at the woods at Aberfroid for water, where Pat Whitehouse showed Bill round. John Adams filmed the departure, and Pat took his camera on the train. The ominously named terminus at Devil's Bridge saw the passengers alight and gave the time for interviews. Sadly, we don't have the recordings, but it looks like she's saying she was enjoying herself. The third narrow-gauge railway that day was the Festiniog. Although it had been reopened in preservation 6 years earlier, in 1961 it still had a certain air of having been neglected for a considerable period and wasn't the immaculate railway we know today. At Portmaddock, 2 stalwarts were seen, the double-ended, Fairley-type engine still being named Taliesin, before it changed to Earl of Merioneth. The Preservation Society had reopened the line in stages. From 1958 to 1968, it ran as far as Tanny-Bourg. The famous cob was unchanged. Back at Portmaddock, the Fairley passes the original 4-wheeled bug boxes, the earliest passenger coaches on the Festiniog, still in use today. The driver was the legendary Bill Hoole, once the best-known East Coast mainline driver, his retirement being something of a change from Gresley Pacific's. The Railway Roundabout series tried to cover all regions of British Railways on a regular basis, giving attention to important changes. In 1961, the southern region had completed its Kent Coast electrification project, which was to have a profound effect on the region's steam locomotive fleet. The cameras visited the Nine Elms depot in London, the principal shed on the southwestern division, providing locomotives for the Waterloo services to Southampton, Bournemouth and Weymouth, and the West of England route to Salisbury and Exeter. In this lineup, a number of ex-South-Eastern and Central Division engines were to be seen. These were transferred to the South-Western to allow that division to withdraw its elderly locomotives and replace them with these slightly less elderly ones. This is an L-class, of which there were 22. They were known as Germans, as the last 10 were built by Borsigs of Berlin. This is one of the British engines, built by Bayer Peacock of Manchester. Behind the L is an ex-Brighton E2 060 tank, of which several examples worked in Southampton docks and at Eastleigh. The lineup also included one of the Southeastern's Class H044 tanks, number 31326. These were the mainstay of the Southeastern's suburban services in the days of steam. The engine in steam at the back is a Brighton E4, examples of which had worked on the Southwestern since the middle of the war. Next is a Southern Region Standard Class 5. The 20 examples allocated to the region were named after characters from the King Arthur legend, following the withdrawal of the original Uri King Arthur class. Maunsell classes were being devastated at this time. Epsom is a member of the class of most powerful 440s in Britain, schools. The class of 40 disappeared over a period of 24 months in 1961 and 62, Epsom becoming one of the last to survive, being withdrawn in December 1962. The class had been built to operate the Hastings main line, which had severe size limitations, but this had been dieselized in 1957, rendering the class surplus to requirements in this area. They remained on Kent Coast duties until 1961, number 30937 being allocated to Battersea, but she had come to Nine Elms following the electrification in Kent. The Southeastern Standard 060 tender engines were Class C. 109 were built between 1900 and 1908. One, number 592, is preserved on the Bluebell Railway. Nine Elms turntable was situated alongside some modern flats, and enginemen were required to keep their charges as quiet as possible here. This is French line CGT, one of the rebuilds of Bulleid's Merchant Navy class of Pacifics. These engines had originally been streamlined or air smooth, and had been rebuilt into this more conventional form by British Railways. A second Merchant Navy appears behind French line CGT. This is Royal Mail. The 30 engines were named to honour the association of the Southern Railway with the various shipping lines which used its port at Southampton. Slightly smaller in their dimensions were the Battle of Britain and West Country locomotives. 110 of the light Pacifics were built, 60 being rebuilt into this form by British Railways. Once again, we have a quick look at the Brighton E4. This engine was originally named Fay Gate. Its preserved sister was the next in line, number 32473 Birch Grove, and is seen heading off shed in the direction of the terminus. Our final views include steam working on the Brighton section. This is a King Arthur, Sir Dodinal Le Sauvage, on a special to mark the centenary of Brighton Works. It was actually filmed in 1956, but included with this film to illustrate Southern engines. The last steam locomotive built at Brighton, Standard Class 4 tank, number 80154, took over the train at Brighton, and the penultimate engine was seen on display. An unusual group of railways had fallen into the Great Western Camp in late Victorian days. The Severn and Wye Valley Railway linked the valleys of those two rivers through the Forest of Dean. It had been an independent route joining the Midland Railway between Gloucester and Bristol, with the Great Western route through the Wye Valley. By 1961, the through nature of the route had been curtailed. It had served as a useful diversionary route for freight traffic when the Severn Tunnel was closed, as it incorporated the Severn Bridge. There was a railway bridge over the River Severn long before the better-known road bridge was constructed. This railway bridge ran from Severn Bridge Station on the western side of the valley to Sharpness on the eastern side. In October 1960, the bridge had been rammed by a small petrol tanker, the 229-ton vessel Westdale, and a number of its 21 spans were brought down into the river. Despite pledges to the contrary, it was never rebuilt, and the railway on either side became dead-end branches. Another SLS rail tour is seen in the summer of 1961, making a pilgrimage to the then disused section between Lydney and Severn Bridge Station, sited near the village of Blakeney. This section had been promoted as an independent company, with the bridge as its main engineering feature, but had amalgamated with the Forest of Dean Railways before becoming a joint company between the Great Western and Midland Railways in July 1894. Lydney Junction was where the two constituent parts of the Severn and Wye made a junction with the Great Western's main line from Gloucester to South Wales. The main line can be seen in the background behind the lines of wagons as the SLS Special makes its way through the separate platforms for the Severn and Wye. Passenger trains had ceased working on this group of lines in 1929, except for the short portion to Lydney Town, which lost them in 1960. Here the station was immediately adjacent to the level crossing over the A48 trunk road, which was to give problems in later years when a preservation company took over the line in the Forest of Dean. Beyond Lydney Town, the railway remained open for freight traffic only, as the Forest of Dean was an important coal mining area. There were a number of branches off the main line, and at Colford Junction, a branch ran off to the southwest to Colford itself. The branch trailed into the main line and trains had to reverse here. The branch was heavily graded, at between 1 in 30 and 1 in 31, and this necessitated the provision of a second engine on the special. The odd formation was caused because the train was working on the push-pull principle. The green liveried pannier tank was one of the 6400 class, which were fitted for push-pull or auto-fitted work. Great Western rules prevented more than 2 coaches being propelled at any one time. So when 3 or 4 coach auto trains were required, as in this instance, the extra coaches had to be coupled on at the other end. The black pannier was one of the standard Great Western General Purpose 060 tanks, which worked throughout the system on passenger and freight turns. Colford Severn and Wye Station was situated alongside the Great Western Station from Monmouth, both being termini connected by a short cord that made a trailing connection with both stations until 1951. 6437, the auto-fitted pannier tank, was one of a class of 40 engines built between 1932 and 1937, specifically for passenger work. Many were repainted in the express passenger green livery in the late 1950s, when the Western region was repainting many different classes in this style, whether they were suitable or not. The Great Western had closed from Monmouth to Whitecliffe Quarry in 1916, the remains of the line here being served by the Severn and Wye station, the trailing cord being replaced by a direct connection in 1951. The branch to Colford had closed to passengers at the same time as the rest of the Severn and Wye, but the Great Western terminus had closed in 1916 when the line was severed. The train returned to the Severn and Wye main line, rejoining it at Colford Junction. The main line was single throughout its 32 miles, except for a short section between Park End and Colford Junction. It's noticeable how well manicured the track is on what was ostensibly a freight-only railway at this time. The tour continued along the main line, passing through the splendidly named Speech House Road Station. The platforms remained 32 years after closure to passengers, Pat Whitehouse taking this view from the signal box. The second pannier came off at Speech House Road, and the train continued along the line to the terminus at Cinderford. The railway itself survived until 1967, north of Park End, the last section from Lydney to Park End closing in 1980.